Alrighty, Internet. Evan Benton of Dogg for Mayor here. I'm going to be talking about the Nuremberg Code, and I decided the best way to do that was just to go through and read it because it's pretty short. So before I do that, of course, the Nuremberg Code has come to prominence in light of current events, shall we say, and there's people are putting out this idea that certain individuals are violating the Nuremberg Code. So I wanted to answer the question what that means, what it means to violate the Nuremberg Code. Okay, so first of all, the Nuremberg Code was written and published in 1947. It came out of the Nuremberg trials, which were, of course, the trials where former or Nazi officers and their collaborators were tried for what were termed war crimes. And so the Nuremberg Code came out of this trial because basically a lot of the legal concepts that were being used during those trials didn't really exist at that time. So the idea of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace didn't really exist until the Nuremberg trials, and they had to sort of invent a concept for the kinds of crimes that the Nazis were being accused of. And so the Nuremberg Code came out of one of the trials of the Nuremberg trial, which was known as the Doctors' Trial. And it was a means of codifying basically what ethical experimentation on human beings entailed. And really interesting, I'm just reading a little bit about it. It actually came out of pre-Nazi Germany and ideas of racial hygiene. So the Germans came up with an idea similar to the Nuremberg Code in order to justify, in some sense, their racial theories at the time. So it's not a legally binding document. It's not like a international treaty or something like that. So if you were to violate it, they could say, hey, look, you violated the Nuremberg Code and we're going to, string you up. That's, some people are putting that idea out that there's, going to be these mass arrests and these trials. The Nuremberg Code isn't about that. It does form, in some sense, a legal precedent for these arguments, and that's basically the point of it. Again, is so they came out, they had these trials, they tried these doctors, and the claim was that they were unethically experimenting on human beings, and so they had to put out a sort of a set of principles for what that meant. What was ethical and what was unethical in terms of human experimentation, and that came out of the Nuremberg trials. Okay, and so while it is not legally binding in and of itself, it did lead to some other documents that are, things that are sworn to by members of the medical establishment, etc. So it is a very important historical document, and it does inform current medical ethics thinking, medical experimentation ethics in particular. So it's a very important document, and it's useful to be somewhat familiar with, even if you're not a doctor. And it's short, so I'm just going to read it. Okie dokie, here we are. And so you can find this anywhere online. I'll put a link to this PDF version below, but there's plenty of sources. It starts with a little preamble, which I'll read. Permissible medical experiments. The great weight of the evidence before us is to the effect that certain types of medical experiments on human beings, when kept within reasonably well-defined bounds, conform to the ethics of the medical profession generally. The protagonists of the practice of human experimentation justify their views on the basis that such experiments yield results for the good of society that are unprocurable by other methods or means of study. All agree, however, that certain basic principles must be observed in order to satisfy moral, ethical, and legal concepts. So unprocurable by other methods or means of study is, of course, the one requirement for all human experimentation. And so the first point is the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision. This latter element requires that before the acceptance of an affirmative decision by the experimental subject, there should be made known to him the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment, the method and means by which it is to be conducted, all inconveniences and hazards reasonably to be expected, and the effects upon his health or person which may possibly come from his participation in the experiment. Yes, so the tendency to editorialize on this point is great. Legal capacity to give consent, so that applies in one case at least to minors, which are now being targeted by a certain experiment, and then of course coercion, and then sufficient knowledge. I would argue is something that nobody has in regard to the current events. All right. Continuing though, the duty and responsibility for ascertaining the quality of the consent rests upon each individual who initiates, directs, or engages in the experiment. It is a personal duty and responsibility which may not be delegated to another with impunity. And this is important in terms of the Nuremberg trials, because prior to the Nuremberg trials, the idea that the soldier was just following orders was a common legal defense, and that was established at the Nuremberg trials that was no longer effective legal defense in terms of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and things like that. And this is a concept where that's being illustrated. All right, point number 2. The experiment should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society, unprocurable by other methods or means of study, and not random and unnecessary in nature. And we saw many examples of seemingly capricious, unnecessary experiments during World War II. Point number 3, the experiment should be so designed and based on the results of animal experimentation and a knowledge of the natural history of the disease or other problem under study that the anticipated results will justify the performance of the experiment. Number 4, the experiment should be so conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. Yes. Number 5, no experiment should be conducted where there is an a priori reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur, except perhaps in those experiments where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects. So that's an interesting little point. If the experimental physicians themselves are also part of the experiment, then they can take extra risks, we can say. Number 6, the degree of risk to be taken should never exceed that determined by the humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved by the experiment. Yes, cost-benefit analysis. Risk-reward. Is that being done today? Point number 7, proper preparations should be made and adequate facilities provided to protect the experimental subject against even remote possibilities of injury, disability, or death. And of course, we are seeing the exact opposite. We are protecting the pharmaceutical companies today. Point number 8, the experiment should be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons. The highest degree of skill and care should be required through all stages of the experiment of those who conduct or engage in the experiment. And as I pointed out in a recent video, the person responsible for approving the current event, as I'm calling it, at the FDA only has a master's in science. So chew on that. Point number 9. During the course of the experiment, the human subject should be at liberty to bring the experiment to an end if he has reached the physical or mental state where continuation of the experiment seems to him to be impossible. Now, I don't know how this would be workable to bring the experiment to an end if you've been injected with something, but at the very least, you should be able to refuse further injections as per the Nuremberg Code, point number 9. Point number 10. During the course of the experiment, the scientist in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage if he has probable cause to believe, in the exercise of the good faith, superior skill, and careful judgment required of him, that a continuation of the experiment is likely to result in injury, disability, or death to the experimental subject. So 2 criteria for ending the experiment. First of all, if the subject feels that they can no longer continue, or if the scientist in his greater judgment feels that the experiment is likely to cause harm to the same subject. I would add too that they should probably discontinue the experiment if they discover during the course of the experiment that it will not yield useful data. All right, so that's it. That's the Nuremberg Code, and then the rest of this is just the legal, basically opinion, I guess you would say, of the court, and just saying how this all relates to the defendants. And I'm not going to read all that, but you can read that on your own from the Nuremberg Code, 1946 to 1949. So, and that's it. I'm not going to expound on those points. I think you can. I think they speak for themselves with regard to what's going on. Clearly, they are being violated, and to the extent that that's legally relevant, that's not my field. And so, just to re-emphasize that point, most scholars, it seems, consider the Nuremberg Code to, well, so there's a question as to the applicability of the Nuremberg Code, keeping in mind that it's not a legally binding document, and it's basically, it's a legal opinion that other legal decisions might definitely draw upon. But the big question is, does it apply to all? Does it apply to medical ethics generally, or does it apply to medical ethics specifically within the field of war crimes or crimes committed during wartime? And most scholars, it seems, believe that it applies to the latter, the sensu stricto of medical ethics. So if you were just to lock people up in your basement, and experiment on them, and they were to arrest you and find that out, for example, the Nuremberg Code would probably not be called upon in your trial. But if you were doing such for a nation state, right, a state actor, then it might be. And so that seems to apply in the current situation. And anyway, that's just about it. I like to read little short documents that everyone hears about but doesn't actually read, when they're so short that I can make a short video like this about it. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, there's some more documents that were inspired by that, and those are coming up in some short videos like this next. But in the meantime, comment below, ask me questions. give me some other grist for the old brain mill, and I'd love to dig into those topics. Like the video, share with your friends, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks very much for watching. This has been Evan Benton of Dogg for Mayor. Have a good night.